Good morning. My name is Sally, and we are continuing this morning our series on sacred memories. You might be the kind of person, I am the kind of person, who loves to look at the past to understand the future. If anyone's ever done that Strength 2.0, I'm that person. I love to look back, love to see what's happened in the past. But I'm aware that not everyone is like me, which is probably a really good thing. Some people just want and get excited about the future and figure that looking back can be a waste of time. And at times it can be a waste of time. I understand that. But this series is teaching us in very real and practical ways that it is so important to understand what the way forward looks like by first of all turning just briefly, just for a season, looking back and seeing what God has been doing so that there's a better understanding of how to move forward. And I'm excited. I mean, as I said, I'm the kind of person who gets excited about looking back. But what we can do in this time is value the past and understand how it informs our future. This has been a great source for me as I have tried to understand a little more of New Hope's story. We embarrassed Janet last week by holding up her painting, which I found out this morning was bought for $1,000. It's worth 10 times that amount, Janet, but it was a fundraiser and she kindly donated it. This week I want to draw your attention to another piece of her artwork, and that is the story that she wrote when she first came to New Hope. Now, many of you have read this cover to cover time and time again, but if you haven't, try and grab hold of a copy. And not only is the stories collected in here so valuable, but part of what goes on in this series and this season is understanding the perspective that can be given when we look back. Now, Janet has a series of quotes, and I want to read out a couple of them. At the start of each chapter, she gives us these encouragements through famous quotes. Winston Churchill said, "The further backward you look, the further forward you are likely to see." Charles Moss said we always need to give attention to where we have come from if we are to understand where we're going. Kierkegaard said life must be lived forwards, but it can be understood only backwards. And not to put Kierkegaard and Max Myers on too level a playing field. Good morning, Max. We are praying for you. But Max has a quote in there. "We dare not ride into tomorrow on yesterday's wheels." And so with these great philosophers in mind, we understand that looking back and understanding who we are better informs us to go forward. Looking back is so valuable, I would say essential. We are looking this morning very briefly at a text in Deuteronomy, and if you want to grab your Bible, you can. It's only a brief reading, and I'm going to read to you from my ordination Bible. Yeah, I know. It's the words are exactly the same as in my old Bible, and they are brilliant, but I get a nice shiny cover, so that's good. Deuteronomy chapter 4, and Deuteronomy at this point, we have to understand a little of the history. Remembering last week, we looked at Nehemiah, we looked at the future. Now we're drawing back to the past. So we have a group of people poised, waiting to enter the promised land. Remember, last week was about rebuilding and about the renewal of covenant. This is going back in history. This is ancient history and valuable history. God has done his magnificent rescue of his people out of Egypt. They have wandered through the desert for 40 years, a journey that should not have taken anywhere near that length of time. But they have wandered, and now they find themselves poised, ready to enter the promised land. And remember who's not going with them? Moses is not going with them, but he gathers them around. He gathers the clans, he gathers the leaders, My little question this week in my mind has been, where were the women in this? I wonder if they were listening at the tent or whether they were invited in. I don't know. But this was a collection of God's people. And he said, you are poised, you are ready to enter, but let's stop for a moment. Let's stop and remember. Deuteronomy 4, starting at verse 9, says, from the words of Moses, be careful. Be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, to Moses, he said, assemble the people before me to hear my words so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land and may teach them to their children. Don't be rushing forward. Don't be saying, right, we're ready to go. Everyone, pack your gear, let's go. Nor do we, as New Hope, say we are poised on the edge of a new season. Quick, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. Let's keep this machine running. Let's not slow down. Actually, there is benefit and there is wisdom in looking behind. What has God done here before? What has God been doing? How has he threaded together the DNA of New Hope? What has he been doing? Moses asked the Israelites to remember. Remember when you stood at the base of that mountain and you received those commands from me. Remember them. He said, remember them. Remember my rescue. Now, remember, if 40 years has passed, some of those teenagers coming out of Egypt are now the older people in the congregation, and some of those people gathered in that community were born in the wilderness, born as refugees, born without a place to call home. Remember the rescue. Remember the mercy that God showed you when you worshipped idols and wandered away from his will and his ways. Remember the 10 Commandments. Remember my provision. And as you remember, you will be better positioned to enter into this new season and this new land that I'm giving you. Will we do this? Will we do this as New Hope? Will we look back to look forward? Will we stop and remember and appreciate and understand who God is and what he's been doing in this place? 73 years is a long time and yet not a long time. Some of you have been alive longer than 73 years. Some of you remember this history way better than me. My question is, what does God want to remind us of as we stand poised? And then individually, what is it that God has said to you as an individual in your past, in your circumstances, in your family, within your trauma, within whatever it is that you've experienced? What is it that God might be stirring in you to remember this morning? And I can't believe I'm saying this, but as we start to wind up 2024 and as we start to think about 2025, what might God be saying as a reminder to you from the past? And you might quite legitimately say to me, Sally, why are you giving this bit? You've been here a minute and a half, and you would be absolutely right. I've actually been here 6 months and 1 week. And it's flown, and I can tell you that I feel like I have spent my 6 months listening to stories, listening to brilliant stories told very intentionally, people coming to me and say, let me tell you a story. And I love that. I love that people tell the stories because the stories tell you a lot. Some have been incidental stories, but they've all gathered together and helped me to see a pattern. I feel like I've been walking along a beach, picking up seashells, and these are the stories. I pick up a story and I hold it and I look for the patterns and I go, interesting, and I put it down, and then I find another one. And as I've gathered those stories, I could stand here this morning and remind us of 100 different threads that is New Hope. But I just want to think about one. You can come up with the other 99, and you have the other 99 to varying degrees. But what is it that this one thread that I sense God saying to this community? It's this: God has always entrusted New Hope with all kinds of people, and trusted this church to stretch wide her arms and allow space. I didn't know what Lance was going to do this morning. I knew his announcements were going to take a while, but now I know why. It was all those stories, wasn't it? About we can stretch a little wider. We can stretch a little. Fortunately, he's got big arms, but a little wider, a little wider. And that seems to be not just a recent occurrence, but one that goes right back to the first stories. Now, this first story is one that I have heard probably a dozen times. Keep telling it to me, because I pick up something different. Everyone has a slightly different emphasis on this story. But in the late 1940s and early 50s, Charles Hemming from Box Hill Baptist rode around on a bike in this area. And he went from place to place. He would stop his bike, lean it on a fence. Kids would come. God would bring the children to him. He would teach a Sunday school lesson. He would hop back on his bike. He would go to another area. He'd hop off his bike. He'd do another Sunday school lesson. And so on and so forth, he would continue. Now, Melbourne is not very conducive to riding around on a bike in the middle of winter, and it soon became apparent that that was not really going to work moving forward. God had brought the people. They had to stretch their arms out wide, Charles and others with him, and they bought a bus. Now, this bus story is legendary around here. I love the bus story. And the bus overtook the bike, and the bus would go to a spot in the morning. Kids would roll onto the bus. They would be taught the Sunday school lesson. They'd hop off the bus would go to the next place, and so on and so forth every Sunday from 9:30 a.m, wrapping up at about 4 p.m. God brought the people in and said, stretch. And eventually people said, how about we run an evening service on the bus? And so that happened. And then it was like, maybe we need a building. Now, I could continue this story, but is Val here this morning? Val Wright? No. She'll be here next week. She's faithfully here. She was a part of this. Beth Naylor was a part of this. Some of you were a part of this story in this season. Be listening to these stories, because they say something of how God has built New Hope. Not known as New Hope then. But as God has brought people along, it has provided wonderful opportunities and challenges to our faith. And so in the late 1970s, the building wasn't big enough. And how many times has this happened in the history? The building's not big enough. The building's not big enough. We have to add, we have to demolish, we have to rebuild, we have to add a bit here, we have to do a bit there. In the 1970s, the church just couldn't accommodate how many people were in the building. And so Fordale Court came on the market, and once again, New Hope stretched its arms wide and made space. Not without a bit of creative thinking, however, because the man who sold the property said, you're not going to look after my plants. I know you want car park. And so in an act of creativity and probably entrepreneurial endeavour, all his plants were packed up and shipped to Queensland so he could replant them in a garden up there. Sometimes you've got to think outside the square, am I right? But New Hope stretched its arms wide and made space. These are more recent stories, jumping forward to what I've seen in this building. Things that excite me, things that tire me. Who was a bit tired after those announcements? That's a lot going on. That's a lot going on. It's wonderful. It is so good, Prue. Absolutely. There is so much happening in this building because God says, stretch your arms out wide. The other day I walked out of events room 5 looking for Hannah, but Hannah was busy with someone. She was ministering to a lady who had several children around her. She was looking a little harassed, and with gentleness and dignity in a way that Hannah is so good at. She was listening, she was providing practical help, she was stretching her arms out wide. I walked through the cafe just this last week, and there were a group of women sitting around having a belly laugh like I haven't heard for a while, just sharing stories together and just having so much fun. And they stayed for 2+ hours, and I just had to stop by their table. I thought, I don't think they're New Hope people, but I'm never really sure, so I play my cards kind of, carefully. But they're not. They just find that space really, really good for them. It's a loving, caring, open space. No one kicks them out after a certain time, and they find that a safe space. Eva and her team know their names, know everybody's names, know their coffee orders, and the arms once again are stretched wide. There's a man who sits in the cafe quite regularly, and I caught him the other day tapping Alan on the shoulder and saying, can we talk about faith? And Alan, of course, stretched his arms out wide. I don't know what meeting he missed. Apologies if it was you. And he just spent time talking about faith with a regular customer. Arms stretched out wide. And I'm not telling you about play space, Bible studies, craft groups, English lessons, mainly music, young mums with babies, a new group that's just started, my favourite group of the week. And not to mention, of course, the young adults who have got their new initiative started. We want more of God. Provide us space. God brings it all here and trusts that New Hope will stretch out its arms and provide space. So as we look back, it teaches us this is probably going to continue. If this has been the last 73 years, chances are we will continue to be asked to stretch wide our arms and make space. And this week, sitting in a meeting with no angst in the room, it was yet another growth issue. Our Chinese congregation is flourishing. It's growing. You've seen baptisms here. People doing alpha, having a meal. I've seen people tucked in all kinds of rooms on a Sunday, and it's like, okay, here we go again. New Hope, how will you stretch your arms out wide? Now, you have to indulge me here because I think there's a parallel experience going on for myself and for our family. And if you'll just, God is speaking to me through all of this, and you can listen in. How about that? I invite you to listen in to what God is saying to me, because he may well have something to say to you, and I think he has something to say to New Hope. In 1996, about October, Raph and I were sitting in a Jeremiah session during internship at Youth Dimension. It's now the Donvale Year 9 campus, but it used to be the Youth Dimension property. Freezing cold building, weatherboard building, and we sat there about September or October, and we were doing our Jeremiah usual lesson. I loved Jeremiah. It was a great teaching series, but ticking along behind all of the sessions we were doing in internship was this question: will we stay in Melbourne, where we had only come for 1 year, or would we return to Perth to our regular everyday lives, where we might have 10 cents to rub together because we had used up all our funds and we had said, God, we'll do whatever you want us to do, but tell us, call us. And in that session, there was that reading from Jeremiah 29, not the one about blessing you, not the one about providing for you, no, the one that says to the people in exile who are dying to go home, he says, settle down, build houses, and have families. And as I sat there in that moment, my heart leapt and sank all at the same time. God, you are very clearly calling us to stay. We all felt it in the room. It was one of those God moments that it's foundational for who we are and what we do. Trouble was, build houses. Okay, well, we've used up every fund we had to come for this adventure in Melbourne, so I'm not sure how we're going to do that. And we had also been trying to have children and thought that's not a journey that God seems to be blessing us with. So here you go. Stay away from your family, stay here, develop a life, build a house, have children. I'm like, I don't see any of the above happening, but God, if you're calling, we'll stretch out our arms and we'll say, use us, we'll stay, we'll be obedient. Don't get too excited for us. We have plenty of disobedient moments, but in that moment we knew what God was asking us to do. Now we find ourselves, Raph and myself, at the start, poised for a new adventure. We've sold our house, and for those playing along at home, that's pretty exciting. We sold our house. But we need to know what the next step is. And we have always tried, sometimes abysmally, but we've always tried to allow space for other people in our home. We have people stay with us, live with us, and we would like to buy a property that is has a facility, has a self-contained part so that people in need can stop for a while. It's impossible. I feel like I'm right back in that youth dimension building, sensing that God might be asking us to stretch our arms out and going, okay, can't see how you're going to do it. And I've had moments along this journey where I've gone, God, I am just going to ask and ask and ask and ask, much like some of us are doing as we consider next year, as we consider a new senior pastor, as we feel a little bit of anxiety about this whole process of succession. And I found myself 2 weeks ago on my way to work. And if you know Bolton Street in Eltham, I was turning a roundabout, I was heading up Bolton Street, and 3 things happened all at once. First of all, I saw the street on the right where we are looking at a property going, yes, but it's beyond us. And so I started my usual ask, sell our property. We hadn't sold it at that stage. Provide, what do you want to do? Give me wisdom, what are you going to do? And I'm frantically giving it all over to God, saying, do something. And then the second thing that happened right then on the left-hand side of the road, there are 2 magpies. Have you seen magpies this time of year? The mother is frantically digging up worms and the baby, fledgling, peewee, I don't know what they're called, the baby magpie is sitting there. I have never seen a mouth open that wide. And it was making that, I won't embarrass myself, it was making that noise, you know that noise. And give me, come on, give me. And I chuckled to myself. I said, God, that's me. It might be you. God, I need you to do this thing. I need you to provide. I need you to open the doors. I need you to save my marriage. I need you to provide this, that, or the other. I need you to do that now. And I just chuckled to myself, that's me. I look back at the past and I see what God's done and I'm still doing it. Still desperately seeking for him to do something now. And then the third thing that happened, 10 seconds later, is my devotional app was reading out all sorts of things, and it read out Psalm 131, and this is a word for me, and you can borrow it. Psalm 131, I don't concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. Instead, I have calmed and quietened myself. Like a weaned child who no longer cries for its mother's milk. Yes, like a weaned child is my soul within me. I'm learning. I'm leaning into that and I'm learning to be truly at peace in my soul. We as New Hope need to develop this same posture of a calmed, and quiet soul. As we look back, we see what God has done, watched him provide people of different languages and nations and experiences and demographics. We've seen him pour them into the building. We've seen our deep moments of trust. We've seen our deep moments of worship. We've seen all of our mistakes and our wandering as a church and as individuals. We know that God gives abundantly. We know we can be calm and quiet, not panicking, not crying out like that magpie, but with a quiet soul and with sacred memories as our evidence of God's provision. We wait. It's always going to be a stretch. This life is a stretch. And I'm wondering where God might be asking you to stretch this morning. It could be that God is asking you to stretch your arms out wide in forgiveness. You know this of yourself. You are challenged again and again to forgive because you have seen God's grace on you. It could be that you have a sense that God is saying, stretch out your arms in generosity. There could be a cause, or it could be the 95% that God is asking you to speak into, trusting that God will always provide enough. It might be that God is asking you to open your arms wide in grace for people around you who you struggle with, people who are wandering, people who are challenging you, knowing that God will provide all the grace that's required for those you love. It could be that God is asking you to stretch out your arms in obedience, like those Israelites being reminded of God's word and his ways and his laws, and you know how you need to obey, but you're struggling to obey. Can you trust that God will provide all that you need for that obedience? Could be that you have walked into this building today and you have no relationship with Jesus. Would you stretch out your arms and allow yourself to be open to who God is and what he wants to do in your life? I would love for us to take a minute or so and allow silence before we sing, and allow God to speak in these quiet moments as you quiet and calm your soul, and allow God to speak, to challenge, to reassure, to fill our community with outstretched arms. Don't stress in this time about hearing from Jesus. Allow him just to speak if he wants to speak, or take a moment to feel his love. Let's take this time in silence.